The grave digger set down his shovel and looked at the priest with an expression that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Contempt. The priest had just offered him 2 pence per day to dig graves for plague victims. Standard rate for manual labor. The rate that grave diggers had always earned. The rate that the church had always paid. The grave digger laughed. Actually laughed at a priest. And said, 20 pence per day or I walk. You can dig your own graves. The priest's face went red. That's 10 times the normal rate. That's what a master craftsman earns. You're just a laborer. The grave digger shrugged. I'm the only grave digger left alive in this city. You've got 200 corpses waiting for burial and they're rotting in the streets. 20 pence per day. Take it or leave it. The priest took it. He had no choice. Because the grave digger was right. Half the city's population was dead. Most of the survivors were sick or caring for sick family members. Maybe 5 men in the entire city were healthy enough to dig graves and willing to risk plague exposure for any price. Supply and demand. Economics 101. Labor scarcity creates labor value. And the Black Death created the greatest labor scarcity in human history. Welcome to the economic revolution that killed feudalism and birthed capitalism. Welcome to the world where grave diggers became the new nobility because death made labor valuable. London, September 1349. The plague had been raging for 18 months. The city's population had collapsed from perhaps 80,000 to 40,000. 40,000 dead in 18 months. Every day brought hundreds more corpses. The living couldn't keep pace with burying the dead. Bodies rotted in streets, in homes, in churches. The smell of death permeated everything. The city was drowning in corpses. And there was nobody to bury them because the people who normally dug graves were dead or sick or had fled or simply refused to work at normal wages. Before we trace how the Black Death transformed medieval economics from a feudal labor system where workers were property to a wage labor system where workers had power, and trust me, we're going step by step, wage increase by wage increase, watching the economic revolution unfold in real time. Comment where you're from. Because what happened economically after the Black Death is happening right now in your economy. Labor shortages after COVID. Workers demanding higher wages. The Great Resignation. Quiet quitting. Workers realizing they have power when labor is scarce. It's the same dynamic that played out in 1350. Comment your location. Let's map who understands that the Black Death's economic legacy is still playing out today. Let me explain the pre-plague economic system so you understand how revolutionary the post-plague changes were. Medieval Europe was organized under feudalism. Lords owned land. Peasants, called serfs in much of Europe, were bound to that land. They couldn't leave. They couldn't seek employment elsewhere. They worked the lord's fields a certain number of days per year as feudal obligation. They paid rent in labor, in produce, in cash when they had it. In exchange, the lord provided protection, justice, and the right to farm a small plot for their own subsistence. It was serfdom, a system barely distinguishable from slavery except that serfs couldn't be bought and sold individually, only transferred with land when land changed ownership. Wages barely existed for agricultural workers because agricultural work was organized through feudal obligation, not wage labor. Craftsmen in cities earned wages, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, weavers. But manual laborers earned minimal wages when they earned any wages at all. A grave digger in 1340 might earn 2 pence per day. A construction laborer might earn 3 pence per day. A skilled craftsman might earn 6 to 8 pence per day. These rates had been stable for generations because labor was abundant. Europe's population had been growing for 3 centuries. By 1340, population had reached approximately 75 million, perhaps the highest in European history to that point. With abundant labor, workers had no bargaining power. Lords and employers set wages. Workers accepted them or starved. That was the system. It had worked that way for hundreds of years. It seemed eternal, natural, divinely ordained. The church taught that social hierarchy was God's plan. Lords ruled. Workers obeyed. That was the natural order. Challenging it was heresy. Then plague killed 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population in 5 years. 75 million people became 40 to 50 million people. The labor surplus became a labor shortage overnight. And everything changed. The grave digger demanding 20 pence per day wasn't an isolated case. It was representative of what was happening across every sector of the economy. In London in September 1349, manual laborers who'd earned 2 to 3 pence per day before plague were demanding and receiving 10 to 20 pence per day. Construction workers were demanding similar increases. Craftsmen were demanding 30 to 40 pence per day, 5 to 6 times pre-plague rates. Agricultural workers were demanding wages for work they'd previously performed as feudal obligation. Domestic servants were demanding wages triple or quadruple their pre-plague earnings. Every worker in every sector realized simultaneously that they had leverage they'd never had before. And they used it. Think about what this meant psychologically for workers who'd spent their entire lives being told they were worthless. That they should be grateful for the opportunity to work for minimal compensation. That they had no rights, no value, no power. Suddenly they had power. Enormous power. The power to demand wages that made them wealthy by historical standards. The power to quit jobs and find better employment elsewhere. The power to negotiate terms. The power to say no to lords and employers and priests who'd had absolute power over them for generations. It must have been intoxicating. It must have felt like revolution. It was revolution. Economic revolution that would eventually become political revolution that would eventually end feudalism entirely and create the modern world. But let's stay focused on the grave diggers because their story illustrates the dynamics perfectly. Grave digging was among the lowest status jobs in medieval society. Grave diggers handled corpses, which was ritually polluting in Christian theology. They worked in cemeteries, which were associated with death and sin. They earned minimal wages. They had no guild protection, no job security, no social status. They were the bottom of the social hierarchy. The people everyone looked down on. Post-plague, grave diggers became essential workers with enormous bargaining power. Cities needed corpses buried or face epidemic disease from rotting bodies. Churches needed graves dug or face religious crises from unburied dead. Families needed loved ones interred properly or face social stigma and religious consequences. Demand for grave digging was infinite. Thousands of corpses needed burial daily in major cities. Supply of grave diggers was minimal. Most were dead. Many survivors refused to work at any price. The few willing workers could name their price. Records from London, Paris, Florence, and other cities show grave diggers earning wages comparable to or exceeding master craftsmen. A Florentine grave digger in 1348 could earn more in a week than a master mason earned in a month. A Parisian grave digger in 1349 could earn enough in 2 months to buy a small house. These weren't skilled professionals. These were men whose only qualification was being alive, healthy, and willing to risk plague exposure. And they were becoming wealthy. Some grave diggers became genuinely rich. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence during plague years, describes grave diggers who accumulated enough wealth to purchase land, establish businesses, marry into merchant families. Men who'd been peasants or urban laborers before plague became property owners and businessmen during plague. The social mobility was unprecedented. The traditional social hierarchy was being shattered by economic forces that the nobility and church couldn't control. Here's the question I want you to answer in comments. If you were a grave digger in 1349, would you demand maximum wages from desperate cities and churches? Or would you accept lower wages to help your community? Comment maximum wages or help community and explain. Because your answer reveals your values. It reveals whether you prioritize personal gain or collective good. It reveals how you'd respond to sudden power after a lifetime of powerlessness. There's no wrong answer. But your answer tells me who you are. Comment honestly. The lords and employers tried to fight the wage increases. They tried to fix wages at pre-plague levels through legislation. England passed the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, legally requiring workers to accept pre-plague wages. The ordinance declared it illegal for workers to demand higher wages or for employers to pay higher wages. Violators could be fined or imprisoned. France passed similar legislation. Italy passed similar legislation. Every European country with significant plague mortality passed laws trying to force wages back to pre-plague levels. It didn't work. The laws were unenforceable because economic reality overcame legal fiat. If you legally cap wages at 3 pence per day but the economic value of labor is 20 pence per day, employers who need labor will pay 20 pence under the table. They'll offer room and board in addition to cash wages. They'll offer employment contracts with bonuses and perks. They'll find ways around the law because they need workers more than they need to obey wage caps. The black market for labor became enormous. Workers negotiated illegal wages. Employers paid them. Everyone ignored the law because the law conflicted with economic reality. The English Parliament tried repeatedly to enforce the ordinance of laborers. They appointed enforcement officials. They prosecuted violators. They imposed increasingly severe penalties. Nothing worked. By 1351, Parliament acknowledged the ordinance was failing and passed the Statute of Laborers, increasing penalties and enforcement mechanisms. It still didn't work. By 1360, wage enforcement was largely abandoned because it was impossible. You can't enforce laws that contradict fundamental economic forces. Supply and demand defeats legislation every time. Let's talk specific numbers because the wage increases were staggering. Pre-plague, an agricultural laborer in England earned approximately 3 pence per day during harvest, 2 pence per day for other work. Post-plague, agricultural wages increased to 8 to 10 pence per day, sometimes 12 pence per day in regions with severe labor shortages. That's a 300 to 400% increase. A construction laborer who'd earned 4 pence per day pre-plague earned 15 to 20 pence per day post-plague. A domestic servant who'd earned 10 shillings per year, 120 pence, plus room and board pre-plague earned 30 to 40 shillings per year post-plague. Every sector experienced comparable increases. For skilled workers, the increases were even more dramatic. Master craftsmen who'd earned 6 pence per day pre-plague earned 30 to 40 pence per day post-plague. In Florence, master masons saw their daily wages increase from 8 soldi to 40 soldi, 500% increase. Venetian ship carpenters went from earning 12 denarii per day to 60 denarii per day, 500% increase. Paris stonemasons went from 8 deniers per day to 36 deniers per day, 450% increase. The skilled workers who survived plague became extraordinarily wealthy by medieval standards. But the biggest beneficiaries weren't skilled craftsmen. They were the manual laborers and agricultural workers who'd previously had no bargaining power. The grave diggers. The construction laborers. The harvest workers. The people at the bottom of the social hierarchy who suddenly had leverage because they were scarce and necessary. These workers experienced not just wage increases but fundamental transformation of their economic and social status. Agricultural workers in particular experienced revolutionary change. Before plague, European agriculture was organized around feudal obligations. Serfs worked their lords' fields several days per week without compensation. This was legal obligation, not employment. Post-plague, serfs started refusing to perform feudal labor unless they received wages. They argued that labor scarcity made their work valuable, therefore it should be compensated. Lords initially refused. The serfs quit, walked away from their feudal obligations, sought employment elsewhere. Medieval law said they couldn't do this. Serfs were bound to land and couldn't leave. But what were lords going to do? They couldn't farm without labor. They couldn't harvest without workers. They needed serfs more than serfs needed them. The lords capitulated. They started paying wages for work that had previously been feudal obligation. They started offering employment contracts instead of demanding feudal service. They started competing with other lords for workers by offering better wages and conditions. The feudal system was disintegrating from economic pressure. Within a generation, feudalism was dying. Within 2 generations, it was largely dead in Western Europe. The Black Death didn't kill feudalism directly. Labor scarcity killed feudalism by giving workers power they'd never had. Some serfs did better than just earning wages. They demanded and received freedom from serfdom. They negotiated contracts that freed them from feudal obligations in exchange for cash rent on land they farmed. They became tenant farmers or freeholders. Some accumulated enough wealth to purchase land outright. Former serfs became landowners. The social mobility was unprecedented in European history. Men who'd been property became property owners within a single generation. The nobility fought this transformation desperately. They passed laws limiting social mobility. They passed sumptuary laws restricting what peasants could wear, what foods they could eat, what luxuries they could purchase, trying to maintain visible class distinctions even as economic distinctions eroded. They passed labor laws requiring workers to remain in their home parishes, trying to prevent migration that gave workers bargaining power. None of it worked. Economic forces were stronger than legal restrictions. Workers continued demanding higher wages. Workers continued seeking better employment. Workers continued accumulating wealth. Workers continued rising socially. The nobility watched their power erode and couldn't stop it. Now here's the second question I want you to answer. Comment your response. If you were a feudal lord in 1350 watching your serfs demand wages and your authority collapse, would you pay the wages and accept the new economic reality, or B, fight to maintain the old system through laws and force? Comment A, pay, or B, fight, and explain. Because this question reveals how you respond to losing power and privilege. Some lords chose A and survived economically. Some chose B and faced peasant revolts that destroyed them. Your answer reveals which you'd be. Let's talk about what this wealth meant for workers. Sudden dramatic wage increases don't just change economic conditions. They change everything. They change diet. Workers who'd subsisted on bread and porridge started eating meat regularly. They started drinking beer and wine instead of water. They started purchasing luxuries their grandparents could never afford. Archaeological evidence from post-plague sites shows dramatic increases in meat consumption, alcohol consumption, and imported goods among peasant classes. Workers who'd lived in poverty for generations were becoming prosperous within years. Wealth changed housing. Workers started demanding better living conditions. They abandoned crowded tenements for larger houses with multiple rooms. They purchased furniture, bedding, cooking equipment, clothing. Probate inventories from the late 14th century show workers dying with personal property worth 10 to 20 times what comparable workers owned in the early 14th century. The material standard of living improved dramatically for surviving workers. Wealth changed marriage patterns. Before plague, many peasants couldn't afford to marry because they couldn't afford to establish independent households. Post-plague, workers earned enough to marry young and establish households. Marriage rates increased. Birth rates increased among the surviving population. The demographic recovery began not just because plague ended, but because economic conditions enabled family formation. Wealth changed education. Workers who could afford it started sending children to school instead of putting them to work as early as possible. Literacy increased among lower classes. Some workers accumulated enough wealth to apprentice sons to skilled trades, creating intergenerational social mobility. A grave digger's son could become a mason. A mason's son could become a merchant. Social barriers that had seemed permanent were permeable when backed by wealth. But wealth also created conflict. The nobility resented workers eating meat, wearing fine clothes, acting above their social station. The church condemned workers for pride and luxury, for forgetting their proper place in social hierarchy. The merchants resented manual laborers earning comparable wages. The old elites were watching their relative status erode and they hated it. This resentment would eventually erupt into violence. The peasants' revolt in England in 1381 was partly caused by post-plague economic tensions. Workers had tasted prosperity and power. They'd demanded higher wages and received them. They'd challenged authority and won. When the government tried to reimpose controls, through poll taxes, through renewed wage restrictions, through attempts to reimpose feudalism, workers revolted. They burned manor houses. They executed nobles. They marched on London demanding abolition of serfdom and economic justice. The revolt was suppressed brutally, but the underlying tensions remained. You can't give people power and prosperity and then take it away without consequences. France experienced similar revolts. The Jacquerie in 1358 was a peasant uprising against nobility, partly driven by post-plague economic tensions. Italy experienced urban revolts as workers fought to maintain wages against employer and government pressure. The second half of the 14th century was characterized by class conflict across Europe, as workers fought to keep gains they'd made during labor scarcity and elites fought to restore the pre-plague social order. The workers largely won these conflicts, not through military victory. Peasant revolts were typically suppressed, but through economic persistence. Wages remained high because labor remained scarce. Feudalism continued eroding because lords couldn't maintain it without workers. Social mobility continued increasing because workers could afford to invest in their children's futures. The economic revolution that began with grave diggers demanding 20 pence per day continued for generations, transforming medieval society into early modern society. Let's examine what happened to specific occupations. We'll track grave diggers, agricultural workers, and construction workers through the decades following plague. Grave diggers. As plague ended and burial demand decreased, grave digger wages declined from their peak but remained well above pre-plague levels. A London grave digger in 1360 earned approximately 8 to 10 pence per day, down from 20 pence during peak plague but still 3 to 4 times the 1340 rate of 2 pence. Some grave diggers accumulated enough wealth during plague years to change occupations entirely. They became tavern keepers, merchants, craftsmen. They used plague wealth as capital to establish themselves in higher status occupations. The social mobility was real and lasting. Agricultural workers. Wages for harvest labor in England stabilized at approximately 6 to 8 pence per day in the 1360s to 1380s, down from peak rates of 10 to 12 pence but still double the pre-plague rate of 3 pence. More importantly, the nature of agricultural employment changed permanently. Workers who'd performed labor as feudal obligation increasingly worked for wages. Workers who'd been bound to land increasingly migrated seeking better opportunities. By 1400, serfdom was largely extinct in England. By 1450, it was largely extinct in Western Europe. The transformation from feudal agriculture to wage agriculture was complete in most regions. Construction workers. Building demand surged post-plague as survivors rebuilt, as wealthy families constructed elaborate houses and tombs, as churches built monuments to plague dead. Construction workers commanded premium wages for decades. A London mason in 1375 earned approximately 12 to 15 pence per day, double the pre-plague rate of 6 pence. Construction trades became routes to prosperity. Workers' children apprenticed to masonry, carpentry, stone cutting. The skilled construction trades became middle-class occupations where pre-plague they'd been working-class occupations. The economic transformation was permanent. Even after population recovered, which took approximately 150 years in most of Europe, wages didn't return to pre-plague levels. Workers had gained leverage they never fully lost. Labor had become valuable in ways it had never been valuable before. The psychological transformation mattered as much as the economic transformation. Workers in 1400 understood that their labor had value, that they had rights, that they could negotiate and demand and organize. Their grandparents in 1340 had understood none of this. The mental shift from accepting servitude as natural to demanding fair compensation as a right was revolutionary and permanent. One more call to action before we finish. Comment, grave digger nobility, if you're still here. And tell me, which occupation's post-plague story should I cover in depth? Physicians who became wealthy treating plague? Merchants who made fortunes on disrupted trade? Craftsmen who exploited labor shortages? I'll research whichever gets the most requests. Comment occupation plus grave digger nobility, so I can count. The long-term consequences of the post-plague labor shortage shaped European development for centuries. Higher wages meant higher demand for goods. Higher demand stimulated manufacturing. Manufacturing stimulated technological innovation. Innovation increased productivity. Productivity increased wages further. Europe entered a positive feedback loop where rising wages drove economic development that enabled further wage increases. This cycle powered the Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, the Commercial Revolution, and eventually the Industrial Revolution. Compare Europe's trajectory to other regions that experienced plague but didn't experience the same labor shortage effects. The Middle East experienced comparable plague mortality but didn't experience comparable wage increases or social transformation. Why? Partly because Middle Eastern societies were organized differently. Less feudalism, more slavery, different property rights. Partly because political systems responded differently. stronger states that could enforce wage controls more effectively. Partly because cultural factors shaped responses differently. The comparative history suggests that plague alone wasn't sufficient to cause transformation. Plague plus specific institutional and cultural conditions produced Europe's unique trajectory. China experienced devastating plague in the 1330s to 1340s but didn't experience comparable social transformation. Chinese feudalism remained intact. Chinese wages didn't increase proportionally to population loss. Why? Again, institutional and cultural factors. Chinese imperial government was stronger and more centralized than European monarchies. Chinese social ideology emphasized hierarchy and stability more strongly than European Christianity did. Chinese labor markets were organized differently with more slavery and state labor mobilization. Same disease, different outcomes because different contexts. The European context was uniquely suited to transforming plague's demographic catastrophe into economic revolution. Fragmented political authority meant workers could flee oppressive lords for better opportunities elsewhere. Competing jurisdictions meant lords had to offer competitive wages or lose workers to rivals. Weak states meant wage controls were unenforceable. Christian ideology's emphasis on individual salvation and free will created cultural space for challenging hierarchy. Guild systems provided organizational models for worker collective action. All these factors combined with labor scarcity to produce revolution. But let's return to the grave digger who demanded 20 pence per day. His specific story doesn't survive. We don't know his name or what happened to him. But we know men like him existed across Europe. We know they demanded and received unprecedented wages. We know they became wealthy. We know they changed occupations, bought property, married into higher classes, sent their children to school. We know they were part of a working-class revolution that transformed European society. The grave digger demanding 20 pence wasn't an isolated, greedy individual. He was the leading edge of historical transformation. He was the future asserting itself against the past. He was the new nobility being born from death and labor scarcity. The title says grave diggers became the new nobility. That's not metaphor. That's economics. Before plague, nobility meant inherited land and feudal authority. After plague, nobility increasingly meant wealth regardless of source. The merchant who made fortunes trading during plague was noble by wealth if not by blood. The craftsman who commanded premium wages and accumulated property was noble by wealth. The grave digger who earned enough during plague to establish himself in business was noble by wealth. The definition of nobility was shifting from birth to wealth, from status to capital, from feudal to capitalist. The grave digger represented that shift. Death made labor valuable. Labor value made workers powerful. Power made workers wealthy. Wealth made workers noble. The circle was complete. We're living through similar dynamics today. COVID-19 killed millions and created labor shortages in specific sectors. Healthcare workers, delivery drivers, grocery workers, warehouse workers, essential workers during pandemic, gained leverage they'd never had. They demanded higher wages. Many received them. The Great Resignation saw workers quitting jobs en masse seeking better opportunities. Employers who'd paid minimum wage for decades started offering $15, $20, $25 per hour. The dynamics are identical to 1349. Labor scarcity creates labor value. Workers realize they have power. Workers demand compensation reflecting their value. Some employers pay. Some fight. Economic reality eventually wins over employer resistance. The grave digger's story is the essential worker's story. The Black Death is COVID. The medieval labor shortage is the modern labor shortage. The history rhymes. But there's a difference. The medieval labor shortage lasted generations because population recovery took 150 years. The modern labor shortage might be temporary because population recovers faster, because immigration can fill gaps, because automation can replace workers. Medieval lords couldn't automate agriculture. Modern employers can automate warehouses, delivery, retail, even some healthcare. The power that workers gain post-COVID might not last if technology replaces them. That's the tension. That's the uncertainty. Will modern workers keep their gains like medieval workers did? Or will automation do what medieval lords couldn't, restore employer power by making labor abundant again? I don't know the answer. Nobody knows. But the Black Death teaches us that when workers have power, they don't surrender it easily. They fight to keep it. They organize. They demand legislation protecting their gains. They invest in skills that make them hard to replace. Medieval workers did all of this. Modern workers are doing all of this. The struggle continues across centuries because the fundamental dynamic continues. Capital wants labor cheap and obedient. Labor wants compensation reflecting value and power reflecting scarcity. That tension drove medieval history. That tension drives modern history. That tension will drive future history until we fundamentally reorganize economic systems. Which seems unlikely. So the struggle continues. Forever. The grave digger set down his shovel and demanded 20 pence. The priest paid. The precedent was set. Workers had power. The world changed. Death made labor valuable. Labor value made workers powerful. Power made workers wealthy. Wealth made workers noble. The new nobility was born in plague pits and mass graves, born from death and scarcity, born from workers realizing they had leverage and using it. 700 years later, workers are still using that leverage, still demanding fair compensation, still fighting for power against capital, still becoming the new nobility through labor value. The grave digger's revolution continues. It never ended. It never will end. Because labor will always have value when labor is scarce. And labor becomes scarce when death takes workers faster than workers can be replaced. The Black Death taught that lesson. COVID reminded us. The next pandemic will teach it again. Death makes labor valuable. Labor value makes workers powerful. The pattern repeats. Forever. The grave diggers became the new nobility. We're all grave diggers now. We're all the new nobility. We're all demanding 20 pence. Some of us will get it. Most won't. But the demand continues. The struggle continues. The revolution continues. Forever waiting to complete itself. Forever being suppressed by capital. Forever resurrecting when scarcity gives workers power. The cycle continues. The grave digger's cycle. The worker's cycle. Our cycle. Always. Forever.